Welcome once again to Fantasy Fiction Focus. We're here today with Arnold Logan, who's in Toronto, Canadian author of Springtime in Lawrence Park. So welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So how are things over there in Toronto today?
It's hot.
Is it supposed to be? I suppose it is. It's June, isn't it? I suppose it's supposed to be hot in there. Now, can you tell us a little bit about this this wonderful book? This is brand new, I think, isn't it? It just came out.
It came out in May, so it's pretty new.
And what's it about? I mean, tell us everything. We all want to know.
Okay. It follows the trajectory of a family in crisis that has solidified their hold on the Canadian elite from their bastion of Lawrence Park, which is the center of Canada's power as a neighborhood, and how this falls out, the repercussions of their position upon their daughter, who is set up on an angelic cloud, and her two brothers who are have kind of the weight of the Barnacle tradition has been put on their shoulders, and how the family deals with the 20th and 21st century. Well, they're rooted deeply into the Middle Ages of England and France.
So a little bit like Game of Thrones without all the swords and the murder. Then
there's no lampreys at the dinner table.
Oh, but it's all about power then, really, and these powerful families, I guess, in the elite, just like most countries have.
Yeah, it's like trying to look within the dynamics of a power-hungry family.
Now, what's inspired this then? Obviously, it's not a common thread, but it's been sort of covered in different books before. But so, what's inspired you to get started on this lovely book?
Well, I think I'd say the first initial impetus was a book called Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens, and in it there's a family that's a minor character, if a family can be a character, called the Barnacles. And I thought, if this family were kind of blown out of proportion, taken out of the Dickens context of the Dickens world, and put into our world, how did these people actually live with themselves? And how did they pursue their ambitions? And how did they cope with their failures? So I, used some of my experience and some of my knowledge and some of various strands, and tried to weave them together into what I hope is an interesting tale.
Now, this came out in May. Now, so how long were you working on this thing? It sounds like one of these epic stories.
Well, for me, as my first novel, it took on the epic dimensions, of writing Gilgamesh. But I don't think I've actually done anything that earth-shattering. But it took me over 2 years from start to finish. Now,
were you inspired by some of the people in your life or people you met to do this? I mean, I don't mean that it's about them, but were some of the characters based on people you've met in your life?
Well, a lot of it is actually memories of people that I've known throughout my life. Some is tales that I've picked up that I kind of thought would suit the story, and I could weave them in, true life stories. And there's just kind of letting the imagination run a bit amok among, the denizens of the elite neighborhood, and see what comes out of that.
Now, so will you be pursuing this same characters and the same sort of themes in a second book? Are there plans for that?
No. This book I see as a one-off. It's a tragedy. so it can't really go any further.
Oh, so it's all over and done with it. Well, having not read the book, and I don't want to reveal the ending, of course. So what would be next then for you? Are you going to continue in your literary career?
Oh yeah, this is my intention. I mean, I've started late in the game, but it's always been my goal to be a writer. It just took me a long time to come to terms with the reality of it. And I have a couple of concepts. One of them right now is like to take a Henry James story, a short story that seemed to me to be have a theatrical quality to it, and rewrite that as a stage play. And this is a way of studying the theater world, because I had this concept of writing a novel based on an impresario playwriter, and as the antagonist. And I don't know much about the world of theater, so I thought, as a way to study theater, to write a play about it and get it staged would be a good research vehicle. I'm also writing some poetry. Well, I would say I'm rewriting some poetry and then submitting it to some quarterly magazines to see if they'll publish it. And I've got a few short stories on the go. But I mainly want to focus on a second novel. So it may be about the theatrical world.
So nothing more about Canada's elites then. We're going to move away from that for now.
Yeah, well, Tom Stoppard, right, who wrote Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, was also one of the inspirations for this novel, Springtime in Lawrence Park, because Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, he, I think very wisely, pulled them out of Shakespeare's canon as a symbolic hedge, a descriptor of the nature of man today. And the Barnacles are in that tradition. The courtiers, the courtiers maybe are rule of the world today, as they have at other times in the past. And so it may contain elements of that, because you can't get away from the effect of power on every world that goes on in society, whether it's theater, architecture, painting, or even politics. It's all kind of integrated into this Weltanschauung of the world's power-hungry types, which I guess is maybe why Game of Thrones is such a huge hit.
Well, the thing is, I think it's so even in a place like Canada, where we pride ourselves on our democratic traditions and our wonderful way of life, a shining example to the world. I suppose is what we see ourselves as here, perhaps. But there's still there's an elite or a group of people who seem to be always running things. Then is there, and it never really changes. Or the personnel change, but it's the same class of people.
What I'm trying to do in Springtime in Lawrence Park is punch holes in that myth. It's kind of like, Voltaire poking holes in French society's wish to see itself as the best of all possible worlds and the best of all possible times. And I think Canadians have been a bit manacled and hooded over on their way to the firing squad by the elite, which I don't think since the days of the family compact have actually changed that much. But then every country in the world is run by a few families, it seems to me, just about. But I don't want to claim such a vast knowledge, but it seems pretty common.
Yeah, well, and elections happen, of course, in most countries these days. But the actual people who are in charge doesn't seem to change a great deal. Is that what you're saying?
I think a lot of elections, sadly, are window dressing. Yeah.
Well, there's certainly a lot to explore. I'm surprised you don't want to try and continue this saga of the Barnacles in a later book. But maybe you will. Maybe you'll come back to it again later on.
Well, it can take different dimensions. There's myriad barnacles in all different facets, right? And even among the Society of Garbage Collectors, there are barnacles within that group. I think it's a mindset more than a political or social position, actually. Like that's the trappings in the heirs, is the clothes, the settings, the cars, and all the social connections, right? But people who are power hungry exist in every corner of human endeavor.
Yeah, and they probably have as well throughout history too. I would imagine. Obviously,
Yeah.
the concept of one family passing on power to descendants and things, eldest sons and all that thing. We sort of got used to that, I suppose, with kings and queens. But that hasn't always been the case. And obviously, kings and queens, royal families, have been overthrown and all killed, and new families come in and take over. So it does happen. Things do change. Yeah. So now you're in Toronto now, but you've traveled quite a bit, haven't you? So you've got that sort of worldly experience that not all of us have. You've traveled and you've lived in other countries, haven't you?
I have lived in a few other countries. I've lived a bit like an army brat without being in the army, or without my parents being in the army. Like my mother was kind of like a gypsy, and after my parents divorced, she kind of wanted to keep moving. My father was the opposite. He wanted to stay where he was. After World War II, my parents came to Canada as a sanctuary, and he wanted to enjoy the peace and quiet that Canada offers to all the immigrants who come here. Whereas my mother, who maybe was more of a fiery character, maybe my father was more like water, and she just wanted to keep everything new and exciting as continually as possible. So I, being, the child, I was taken around and moved and shunted around and experienced kind of like, a circus, an elephant in the zoo. I don't know if you've ever been to poor countries where they have zoos and they underfeed the animals on purpose to make them more lively in their cages. And I guess I kind of felt a bit like one of those elephants.
So did this the traveling you've done, or the places you are, did that have any influence on this particular book? Obviously, it's set in Canada, but you must have met lots and lots of interesting people. Did it influence this Springtime in Lawrence Park at all? Your upbringing and travel?
I think if you catch the prologue to the book, which is the introduction of Dr. Barkis, whose notes the book are based on, by my doppelganger, Arnold Logan, the editor. And by the prologue, you can see that both Barkis and Logan are outsiders. They're who are granted access to the fishbowl, and they can perceive what's going on in the fishbowl. And I suppose that since I'm the author and the maker of both Barkis and Logan, the editor, that these are two alternate faces of my own.
So, okay, oh, interesting stuff. So, are you planning on traveling elsewhere in the world again now? Are you settled now where you are?
No, I'd love to get moving again and get on the road and get out there in the wilderness, but circumstances have conspired against me thus far.
Well, that's what circumstances tend to do that. So, what was the most interesting country? A quick question. What was the most interesting country, or the one that sticks out most in your mind that you lived in whilst growing up? Or the most interesting place, not the country, interesting
that
place.
I've lived in? Wow. I have a hard time with actually putting a hierarchy on things because they're all interesting. And I like to keep all my memories democratic.
Mm.
So I can't really say any one place was more interesting than the other. They all had their qualities, which you want to keep in your memory so you can transpire them into a novel or a play or a poem.
Yeah, probably the safest way to say it then would be that Toronto itself, of course, is the most fascinating place you've ever lived in, and it's the wonderful place.
It's the place I was suffered to know. And I know it from the suffering man's perspective, which is totally the opposite of the public relations image you get of Toronto, or even all the high flyers who promote it as some wonder city.
Or indeed the elites who live there and run the place.
Yeah, well, they love it because all their fellow elitists are there and they can get together at the golf club and party on, right? I don't mind that. I don't resent the elite enjoying their lives. But what I resent is the spirit that I depict in Springtime in Lawrence Park, which suffuses humanity. It's not restricted to the elite. And I hope that in my novel, it comes out that we're all equally guilty. Because Baudelaire, the great Baudelaire, was one of my major inspirations for this novel. And if anyone could point out to you that you're a hypocrite, whether you're Baudelaire's brother or his teacher or his student, you could be any of those three, but you're still just like him, a hypocrite. It's okay, because that's the purpose of art, is to point out, to remind men that we're all flesh and blood and we're all hypocrites.
But we're not all authors, of course, unlike yourself. And you're busy on something else, I would imagine, by now. You mentioned this one about the theatrical world. Are you actually working on that now, or is that something just the idea that you're going to get to?
I've started to draw up notes on it, but I've drawn up notes on a few projects. So actually, that one is actually not at the top of my agenda right now. I'm more preparing the poetry for submissions.
Now, you mentioned with the just outlines or a plan or something. With Springtime in Lawrence Park, did you create a plan for that, or did you say, I've got this great idea for a story, I'm going to start at the beginning, go through to the end? Or did you actually organize it before? Because some people do, and some people don't.
Like I read your bio, and I saw that you've written tons of books. Like, I was very impressed at your productivity. I haven't read any of your books, I'm sorry to say, but I'm not too much into fantasy. I was into Isaac Asimov a lot as a teenager, and H.P. Lovecraft was good.
Well, I can forgive you because there are so many books. I mean, I haven't read them all myself, actually.
That's a good one. You write them in your sleep, probably, right?
But I know with my first one, I think most people with the first book, perhaps not, a lot of people, they don't do an outline. They think they've got a good idea, and they'll the muse will take them, and it'll flow, and it's some sort of mystical power or something, perhaps. But it's not a good idea with especially fantasy book. You've got to keep on track. And ever since the first one, I've created an outline, even if it's a vague outline, a couple of pages. I need to know where it's going. And sometimes it's been a very large outline, and sometimes it's been shorter. But it keeps me on track. And it does change. Usually it's that third quarter of the story that changes quite a lot. But I know how it starts. I know what it's about, and I know how I want it to wrap up. It's the middle bits that get changed, but it evolves. But I like to have a plan, a skeleton, to keep me on track. So
that's the word I would use, skeleton. Like, that's what the great thing about this being my debut novel. I did have it in my head outlined, but when I wrote down the skeleton or a chapter synopsis, right, that was the genesis. And when I had an 18-chapter synopsis, then I could just get to work on the chapters. And it was surprisingly, by organizing it a bit, I found I could write a much better piece of work than following the muse and stream of consciousness and all that stuff. But that's just me. My father was a highly organized person, almost like a religious man, that he followed a ritual, a daily ritual, which he never varied from. And my mother was creative in the sense that she never liked repetition. So by creating some order and then having no repetition within the order, or at least maybe that's a bit of a self-inflated point of view. I don't know. You have to read the novel and tell me, hopefully. But yeah, so I had the order, I had the organized skeleton, and when everyone asked me, I use that exact phrase like you did, skeleton. When I discovered you can build a skeleton and then add the flesh and the blood and the bones and the veins and the organs, then I realized that a novel is not such a frightening thing to write.
Yeah, I think it works. It works for me anyway. It doesn't work for everyone. I know that years ago I assumed that everyone did an outline or a plan, and I found out that they didn't. And some people just do get the muse gets going, you know, and they just follow their inspiration. But I found that there's an awful, even with an outline, you've got an awful lot of stuff in your head all the time because you're thinking about, oh right, I need to get to that piece that's in chapter 16, and right now I'm on chapter 8, and oh yeah, I need to think about that, and you think of a new idea, and it's all happening at the same time. But a plan at least keeps you, I think, on track with that, and it's certainly helped me over the years. So now, what are you up to with the promotion of this book? Obviously, we're talking on here now. And it's on Amazon and all the other places. Are you doing any events and personal appearances and things like that at bookstores and everything?
Well, I haven't, no. I haven't done any personal appearances. I've done a few interviews, and Fire and Ash is doing some advertising. And that's about the state of things, yeah.
Well, obviously, some people do, some people don't. I mean, I do a fair bit myself, but some people don't. And my books are for young adults, so that it's a bit easier to promote to children, schools, and things like that. And obviously, we all have to do all this social media stuff and things these days in varying degrees. But it's important. It's somebody actually mentioned to me the other day. They said. They asked me, so, well, is it all worth it, all this stuff that you're doing? And I said, well, that's a very good question, because I'm not sure. Unfortunately, we seem to have to do it. We have to have Twitter and Facebook and everything else. And I suppose we're just throwing all this stuff at the wall and hoping something sticks, really. And hoping that that books will sell. But it certainly sounds like an interesting book and everything. So I wish you all the best of luck with that. I'd like to thank you as well for being on here with us. And we hope to see this book on the bestseller list in the very near future.
Oh, great! I appreciate that. Very kind of you, Simon.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being on here.
Okay. Cheers.